Back in 1992, Jason was just a high school sophomore. Unlike most of his classmates, who spent their evenings flipping burgers at fast food joints or stocking shelves at the local grocery store, he had a different kind of job. Jason was good with his hands, really good. While other kids were learning how to work a cash register, he was learning how to tear down walls, lay down floors, and fix cars. He had been doing this kind of work since he was 14, always under the table. It was a perfect setup. He only worked when he was needed, which meant evenings and weekends, and in return, he got paid without the hassle of a regular schedule. It was tough work, but Jason didn't mind. It kept him busy, and more importantly, it kept money in his pocket. One of Jason's main contacts specialized in remodeling projects, restaurants, bars, retail shops, and other commercial spaces. The catch? The work could only be done after hours, when the businesses were closed. But that worked out perfectly for Jason. He had school during the day, so late night and weekend shifts fit his schedule just fine. This particular contractor trusted Jason enough to leave him alone at job sites with a list of tasks, mostly demolition work. While the main crew focused on installation and remodeling, Jason was the one tearing things down, clearing out the old to make way for the new. Despite being the youngest worker, he had earned their respect. He didn't complain, didn't slack off, and pulled his weight like any grown man. The best part? The money. In just one night, Jason could make more than his friends did in an entire week working at McDonald's. One evening, Jason got a call from his contractor. There was a project lined up for the coming Saturday, just a one-man job perfect for him. Without hesitation, he agreed. The guy reminded him to bring plenty of food and drinks since there was nothing nearby. Jason was used to that. He had a small cooler he always packed for jobs like this, stuffing it with Cokes, Gatorade, chips, and a couple of sandwiches. He could eat like a machine back then, an entire pizza if he wanted to, but with the kind of work he did, he burned it all off without a second thought. That Saturday morning, Jason's contractor picked him up as usual. Since he didn't have a car or even a license yet, this was their routine. He'd get a ride to the job site, get dropped off, and work solo until it was time to be picked up again. Jason rarely worked with the main crew. Those guys were the skilled laborers, the ones who built things up. Jason? He was just the tear-out kid, the one who cleared the wreckage before the real work began. But this time, Jason made a mistake. A small one, but one that would come back to haunt him. He didn't pay attention to where they were going. He was too caught up in conversation. Talking about cars, his real passion. His goal was to save up enough money to buy an old muscle car and rebuild it from the ground up. That dream was always on his mind, and it completely distracted him from the fact that he had no idea where this job site actually was. The drive took a long time longer than usual. As Jason stared out the window, he started noticing just how isolated they were. Most people didn't think of California as having desolate, empty stretches, but back in the early 90s, the Mojave Desert was full of them. Huge plots of land stretched out endlessly, with homes scattered miles apart, like forgotten outposts in the middle of nowhere. At some point, they left the main highway, winding onto smaller two-lane roads that seemed to go on forever. Jason wasn't sure how many turns they had taken, but he knew they were far, far from anything familiar. Then, almost as an afterthought, his contractor asked about his drinks. Jason assured him he had enough, but the man reached into his truck and pulled out a jug of water. It was brand new, but the plastic looked slightly dusty, as if it had been sitting there for a while. He handed it over, telling Jason to take it with him, just in case. The house he'd be working at had no running water. As they pulled up to the property, Jason barely had time to take in his surroundings. His contractor was in a rush, eager to drop off the tools and get to another job site. Without hesitation, Jason jumped out and started unloading. Breaker bars, shovels, a pry bar, hammer, broom. He moved quickly, hauling out heavy trash bins and his own small tool bag. He had done this routine 100 times before, but something about this place felt off. Maybe it was just the isolation. There were no neighbors in sight, no signs of life, just a worn-down house standing alone in the middle of the vast, empty desert. Before driving off, the contractor told Jason he'd be back around 5 or 6 p.m. There was no electricity at the site, and with no running water either, there was no reason to stay past sundown. Besides, Jason knew what that really meant. He was only getting paid until then, so he'd better get everything done on time. That was always their understanding. The guy was fair, never asked for anything unreasonable, and Jason always managed to finish his work within the expected time. Today should have been no different. But as the truck disappeared down the long, empty road, leaving nothing but dust in its wake, Jason realized just how alone he really was. As the sound of the truck faded into the distance, Jason stood there, alone. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no people. Just the dry, still air of the Mojave Desert pressing down on him. He turned toward the house and stepped inside. It was mostly empty, just a hollow shell of what had once been a home. His job was clear: strip it down completely. Every last piece of furniture, every appliance, all the flooring gone. The kitchen and bathrooms had to be gutted, and the old wood paneling ripped off the walls. It was a full teardown, the kind of job meant to turn a forgotten place into something worth selling again. Just another flip. Jason had done this kind of work before, but as he stood in the middle of that empty house, something about this place felt different. Almost immediately, Jason felt it, that creeping, uneasy sensation at the back of his neck. Something about the house just wasn't right. And that was strange because he was used to working alone, even at night. But here he was, in broad daylight on a Saturday, and yet the place still managed to unsettle him. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and time. It was cool, unnaturally so, the kind of cool that raised goosebumps on his arms, despite the desert heat outside. The deeper he walked in, the more the house felt like a time capsule, untouched for decades. The dark green carpet, flattened and matted, reminded him of old, rotting broccoli. Pine wood covered almost everything, stained dark with age. The paneling wasn't the cheap stuff from the 80s, either. This was real wood, tongue and groove, solid and heavy. The windows were draped with old-fashioned curtains, the kind you'd imagine a grandmother sewing by hand. In the kitchen, everything was a sickly avocado green. The sink, the stovetop, the oven like a forgotten relic from the past. And then there was the leftover furniture, sitting in the dim light as if waiting for someone to return. But the worst part? A closet filled with old stuffed animals, their fur worn thin with age, their glassy eyes dull and lifeless. The entire house had a strange Western ranch aesthetic, complete with wagon wheels mounted on the walls and scattered outside. It should have just been another job, another rundown house in need of fixing, but Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this place wasn't quite empty. Jason had brought along his old battery-powered radio, his usual trick to keep himself company on solo jobs. The reception out here was terrible, barely picking up a handful of stations, but he didn't care. Any noise was better than the eerie silence pressing in around him. He got to work, starting with the junk left behind. With no dumpster on site, he did what he always did, made a trash pile outside. One by one, he hauled out the old furniture, broken appliances, and whatever else had been abandoned in the house. Next came the flooring. To his relief, it came up easily, peeling away with little effort. Rip, cut, toss, he fell into a rhythm, the repetitive motion almost distracting him from the uneasy feeling still gnawing at the back of his mind. Then came the fun part, the kitchen. Armed with a big demo hammer, he tore into the cabinets, countertops, and anything else in his way. Wood splintered, old fixtures cracked apart, and within an hour, the entire kitchen lay in ruins at his feet. It should have felt satisfying. But something about the house, the way the air still felt too cold, The way shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far in the dim interior kept Jason on edge. Throughout the day, Jason found himself using that big jug of water his boss had given him, rinsing the dust and sweat from his hands and face. But as the afternoon wore on, the relentless dryness of the desert started to take its toll. Anyone who had spent time working in the Mojave knew how the air seemed to pull the moisture right out of you. By late afternoon, he was down to his last drink, and every scrap of food he had brought was long gone. No big deal, he thought. His boss would be back soon, just a couple more hours at most. With the job nearly done, Jason made sure everything was in order. Every bit of flooring was torn out, the kitchen and bathrooms gutted, and all the junk removed. For good measure, he even swept the entire house, leaving it spotless and ready for the rehab crew to start their work. As the sun dipped lower, the house felt different. Empty, yes, but not in the way an abandoned building should. More like something unseen was waiting in the quiet, hidden in the corners where the light didn't quite reach. Jason shook off the feeling. He was just tired, dehydrated. His ride would be here soon, and then he'd be out of this place for good. The time of year had spared Jason from the brutal heat of the desert, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turned sharp and cold. The desert had a way of draining the warmth from the world the moment daylight disappeared. He had brought a flannel shirt, but it wasn't enough. The chill was setting in fast, and the darkness was coming with it. This was before cell phones were common, and with no electricity, water, or even a landline in the house, Jason had no way to call for help. Hours had passed, and his boss still wasn't back. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach. Something was wrong. Thinking fast, he climbed onto the roof of the house, hoping to get a better view of his surroundings. From up there, he could see the dirt road stretching far into the distance, eventually connecting to a smaller paved road. A few houses dotted the landscape miles away, but they were all completely dark. No porch lights, no signs of life. Jason made up his mind he'd hike down to one of the houses and ask to use a phone. Anything was better than waiting out here alone in the cold. He set off on foot toward the nearest house. But when he got there, his stomach dropped. The place was just as lifeless as the one he had been working on. The windows were empty, the yard overgrown, and the doors slightly ajar. No one was home. And worse, it looked like no one had been there for a long time. Back in the early 90s, the economy had started to take a downturn, and foreclosures were everywhere. Entire neighborhoods had been left abandoned, and Jason had worked on plenty of them before. Still, standing in front of this lifeless house in the middle of nowhere, the reality of his situation began to sink in. Darkness was closing in fast, and he had to make a decision. He had three options. 1. Stay in the house he had been working on and wait until morning. 2. Try to hike out in the pitch-black Mojave night with barely any water left. 3. Wait until first light and walk towards civilization, hoping to find help. Then, another thought hit him, one that sent a chill down his spine, colder than the desert air. No one knew where he was. His boss was the only person who had any idea, and Jason had no clue if the guy had told anyone else. His family? They wouldn't even start to wonder about him until Sunday night, maybe. He had always been the type to work as much as possible, saving every dollar for his dream car. They were used to him staying out late, even crashing at a friend's place after a long shift. For the first time, the isolation truly hit him. If something happened, if he got lost, if he got hurt, no one would come looking, not for a long time. Darkness swallowed the desert completely, stretching in every direction. But as Jason looked up, he had to admit out here, the night sky was incredible. The stars seemed endless, and the moon was bright enough to cast faint shadows across the empty landscape. He had no flashlight, no matches, nothing to start a fire. He had tried, breaking up pieces of construction debris to make a small bonfire, but without a way to light it, it was pointless. The temperature kept dropping, probably into the low 40s, and with nothing but a flannel shirt. The cold was seeping into his bones. That left him with only one option: the house. It had been unsettling during the day, but now, sitting alone in the dark, it felt wrong, as if it had been waiting for him to come back. At around 8 p.m., the batteries in his radio started to fade. The tiny bit of light it gave off flickered, and the faint crackle of static and music sputtered, growing weaker by the second. Jason felt the weight of the silence creeping in again, heavier than before. Grabbing an old wooden chair, he set it down in the living room, facing the front door. He didn't know why, but something about turning his back to the rest of the house made his skin crawl. Sitting there in the dim moonlight, in a house that felt too empty, Jason braced himself for the longest night of his life. As Jason sat there, the silence of the desert night wasn't so silent anymore. The wind had picked up, whispering through the cracks in the walls, making the old house groan as if it were breathing. In the distance, he could hear strange noises, probably animals, he told himself. But then came the sound that made his heart skip: leaves crunching, like footsteps, slow and deliberate. Not close, but not far enough for comfort. Shivering from the cold, Jason forced himself to focus on anything other than the eerie sounds outside. The fireplace. If he could get a fire going, he could at least keep warm. He set to work, desperately trying to spark something, rubbing sticks together, breaking apart bits of old wood, his movements growing more frantic. It probably looked like something straight out of Cast Away, except he wasn't on a beach. He was trapped in an abandoned house in the middle of the Mojave, with no one knowing where he was. As he sat there, crouched next to the fireplace, he realized something unsettling. Even with the moonlight outside, the house seemed too dark. It had been dim even during the day, the kind of unnatural gloom that made every room feel smaller, suffocating. But now it was pitch black. Not the kind of darkness that came from the night, but something else, something thicker. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't just dark, it was watching. Jason's mind was starting to betray him. Shadows flickered along the walls, shifting just out of sight. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just the moonlight playing tricks. But then he saw it again, and again, shapes moving outside. And worse, inside. Then came the whispers. Low, just beneath the wind, indistinct but unmistakable. Like someone or something was murmuring just out of reach. His pulse pounded in his ears. He shot up from the chair, his voice breaking the silence as he shouted into the darkness. "Hello?" the house answered. A loud thud echoed from the far side of the house. Something had fallen, or been pushed. Jason didn't wait. His body moved before his brain could catch up. He bolted for the door, bursting outside, sucking in the cold night air like he'd been drowning in the suffocating dark of the house. Under the moonlight, he could finally see. But what he saw wasn't any better. Off in the distance, something moved. Not just the wind, not just an animal, something with shape. Size, he couldn't make it out, but he could feel it watching him. His tools were still stacked at the edge of the house, waiting for when his boss would hopefully come pick him up. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward them, his hands fumbling through the pile until he found what he was looking for. Big Daddy, his heavy pry bar, the one he used to tear through walls and break apart stubborn beams. It was solid, heavy in his grip, a real weapon if he needed it. Whatever was out there, whoever was in there, he was ready for them. Jason couldn't stay still. The cold was cutting through his thin layers, his undershirt and flannel doing little to keep him warm. The wind was picking up, sending chills straight to his bones, and the emptiness around him felt even more vast, endless. He turned in every direction, scanning for any sign of life. But as far as he could see, there was nothing. No house lights, no car headlights. Just darkness stretching out in every direction. Climbing back onto the roof was too risky. One misstep in the dark, and he could break something. Instead, he spotted the gate leading to the property, the metal bars offering just enough height to give him a better vantage point. With numb fingers, he gripped the cold steel and pulled himself up, balancing carefully as he peered into the distance. His breath was heavy, visible in the freezing air. He strained his eyes, hoping, begging to see something, but the night gave him nothing. No help, no hope, just more darkness, and somewhere beyond it, something waiting. Jason's thoughts turned dark. The Mojave Desert had its stories, whispers about bodies buried in the sand, about satanic groups performing rituals far from prying eyes, about people who went missing without a trace. He had always brushed those stories off as just that, stories. But now, standing alone in the freezing night, every single one of them felt real. Every sound made his pulse race. Every shifting shadow sent a fresh wave of fear through him. He knew no one was in that house. He had been alone in there all day, but then, why did he keep hearing sounds inside? Faint, almost like movement, shuffling, a creak of wood. A whisper carried on the wind. His grip tightened around the pry bar as he backed toward the front porch, his eyes locked on the living room window. He crouched down, huddling against the cold, but he couldn't tear his gaze away from the glass. At any moment, he expected to see something staring back at him. By 11 p.m., Jason checked his watch, realizing just how long the night was going to be. Everything, the shadows, the whispers, the creeping paranoia, had only started after dark. During the day, the house had just felt old and abandoned. Now it felt wrong, alive, like it was feeding off the night, growing heavier with each passing hour. 6 more hours until daybreak. The thought made his stomach sink. How was he going to last that long? His mind raced, searching for a plan, something to focus on other than the overwhelming silence pressing in from all sides. And then it hit him. The moment the first light touched the horizon, he was leaving. He didn't care how cold it was, how tired he'd be, or how little water he had left. As soon as dawn broke, he was heading east. He knew that direction would eventually lead him to somewhere, a road, a town, anything. The dirt road leading from the property connected to a paved one further out, and if he could just get there, he'd have a chance of finding help. He gripped his pry bar tighter and glanced at the house again. 6 more hours. He just had to make it 6 more hours. By the time midnight crept closer, Jason was wide awake, his body running on pure adrenaline. His eyes were locked on the dirt road, silently begging for headlights to appear, any sign of life, someone who could help. Any second now, a car could come, maybe someone driving by. Maybe his boss finally coming to pick him up. Then, for some reason, he turned back toward the house. He had been hearing noises inside all night, brushing them off as rats or maybe the wind shifting debris. But as his gaze swept over the dark interior, his breath caught in his throat. A shadow, a tall human-shaped shadow moved from the kitchen, down the hall. Jason froze. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but his brain was still catching up to what he had just seen. That wasn't an animal. That wasn't his imagination. That was a person. Panic surged through him and he shot to his feet, backing away from the porch. His heart slammed against his ribs. His legs moved on instinct, but in his desperation, he tripped his foot catching on debris. He hit the ground hard. Dust kicked up around him as he scrambled to get up, but before he could, he fell again. No, he didn't fall. It felt like something pushed him. For a split second, his mind spiraled. Was it fear? Was he imagining things? Or was there actually something there, unseen, holding him down? Then, blinding light. Jason's eyes widened as bright headlights cut through the darkness, getting closer. He was still on the ground, chest heaving as the lights bore down on him. Someone was coming. But was it help? Or something worse? Jason scrambled to his feet as the truck pulled up. its headlights blinding him for a second. His boss stepped out, looking at him like he had completely lost his mind. "What the heck are you doing?" His expression seemed to say, but Jason didn't care. He wasn't mad, wasn't even thinking about how long he had been out there alone. He was just relieved, so relieved, to finally see another human being. Shaking off the night's terror, he asked what had happened. His boss sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He explained that there had been a mix-up. He had assumed the other crew was coming to get Jason, and they had assumed he was picking him up. It wasn't until later in the evening, when the other crew leader mentioned Jason's progress, that they both realized no one had actually gone back for him. By then, it had already been hours, and it had taken nearly 2 more for him to drive all the way back. He felt awful about it. To make up for it, he told Jason he'd pay him for the entire time he had been stranded out there. Then, without another word, he reached into his cooler, grabbed a can of Coke, and handed it over. Jason had never been so thirsty in his life. He cracked it open and drank it down in a single gulp, the icy liquid burning his dry throat. Once they were back near civilization, they hit a fast food drive-thru, and Jason ate like he had never eaten before. As they drove home, Jason finally asked the question that had been clawing at his mind all night. "What's the deal with that house?" His boss just shrugged. He didn't know anything about it. Just that they were hired to gut it. No history, no background, nothing. Jason never told him about what he had seen, what he had heard. Maybe he didn't want to sound crazy. Maybe he just wanted to forget. But after that night, he made a promise to himself. Extra batteries, a flashlight, double the amount of water. And most importantly, he would never let himself get stranded in the middle of nowhere alone again. In the summer of 1984, Nick and his friend David set out on a 10-day backpacking trip, hiking the Ray Lakes Loop in Kings Canyon National Park. It had been an unforgettable trip, days filled with stunning mountain views, crystal clear alpine lakes, and the kind of solitude that only the deep wilderness could offer. But now, on their final night, the adventure was coming to an end. By the next afternoon, they have just an 8-mile hike back to Nick's Jeep, parked at Grants Grove Trailhead. For their last night, they decided to camp near Bubbs Creek Trail Camp, but they had another idea, one that most hikers avoided. There was a way to cross the creek, but it wasn't on any official trail. A massive tree had fallen across the rushing water, forming a natural bridge. It was only about 20 feet across, with a 6-foot drop into the creek below. Not too dangerous, but the water was fast and deep, and sharp rocks waited beneath the surface. Falling in wasn't an option. They had done this crossing before and knew the drill: unbuckle the backpack before walking across, just in case. If someone slipped, they could throw their pack to the side instead of being dragged under with it. The reason they wanted to cross? On the other side of the creek, deep in the trees, was a secluded camping spot that few people ever used. It was quiet, undisturbed, and felt like their own hidden corner of the wilderness. But as they made their way across that fallen tree, neither of them had any idea that their last night in the mountains was about to take a turn they would never forget. Nick and David made it across the creek without issue, setting up camp in a familiar spot right on the edge of the forest, with a vast meadow stretching out before them. It was the perfect place to spend their last night in the wilderness. They split up to gather firewood, moving into the trees where dead branches were plentiful. Nick quickly gathered an armful and returned to camp, just about to head back out for more when David burst through the bushes. He had no wood. His face was pale, eyes wide with something close to panic. Nick frowned, instantly on edge. What the hell is going on? David was breathing hard. "A deer charged me." Nick blinked. "What?" "Come on, deer don't attack people." "I'm not lying," David insisted. "A huge buck ran straight at me. I dropped my wood and took off." Nick studied his friend's face. David wasn't the type to scare easily, but this? He looked rattled. Still, The whole thing sounded ridiculous. He figured maybe his friend had just startled the animal and it bolted in his direction. They let it go. Eventually, they got a fire going, cooked dinner, and settled in as the sun dipped lower behind the trees. The warmth of the fire helped ease the tension, and they sat there in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. Then, just before dusk, movement caught Nick's eye. From the tree line, a massive buck loped out into the meadow. A full 10-point monster, easily one of the biggest deer Nick had ever seen. And right behind it, moving gracefully through the tall grass, was a doe. David wasn't crazy. The deer was real. But Nick had no idea that this was just the beginning of the night's strange events. David's voice was almost a shout. "Asterisk, that's him." Both of them jumped to their feet, staring at the massive buck standing in the meadow. But something was off. The deer wasn't acting like a normal wild animal. It wasn't skittish, wasn't startled by their movement or the crackling fire. Instead, it was watching them, staring them down, and then, slowly, it started walking toward their camp. Nick felt a cold unease settle in his gut. This wasn't right. He had been hiking, camping, and backpacking since he was 12, always out in the wilderness with his older brother. He had seen plenty of deer before, but never had he encountered one that acted like this. Instinctively, he grabbed a heavy piece of firewood and slammed it against the hollow log he'd been sitting on. The sharp, echoing crack should have sent the animal running. It didn't. Instead, the buck pawed at the ground, its muscles tensing. Then, it started toward them. Nick and David froze. Asterisk, oh shit, what do we do? The only real defense they had was bear spray, but it was buried in their packs, completely useless in that moment. The buck kept closing in, 30 feet away. Then, without warning, it charged. Nick's breath caught in his throat. But just as quickly as it lunged forward, the buck veered off, bolting into the forest with its doe chasing after it. Silence. Nick and David stood there, wide-eyed, their hearts slamming in their chests. Neither of them spoke at first. They just stared at each other, both thinking the same thing. Asterisk, what the hell just happened? But the night wasn't over, not even close. After a while, their nerves settled, and the fear from the buck encounter started to fade. It was fully dark now, and with the fire crackling beside them, they leaned back and gazed up at the stars. The canyon walls surrounding them were massive, towering 1,000 feet high, but set back far enough that the night sky was wide open. No city lights, no noise. Just an endless stretch of deep black, speckled with countless stars. They were still talking about the deer when they both saw it. At first, it was just a bright, steady white light coming over the lip of the canyon. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't a satellite. It was too high to judge its exact altitude, but it didn't move like anything they had ever seen before. It bobbled, zigzagging across the sky in a way that made no sense. It kept a general forward direction, but would slow down, then suddenly shoot off at an angle, then speed up again. It moved back and forth, stopping and starting, almost like it was searching for something. Nick and David sat frozen, watching in silence, their minds racing to explain what they were seeing. First, the unnatural buck. Now, this, and something in Nick's gut told him whatever was going on tonight. It wasn't over yet. Nick and David sat there, mesmerized, watching as the glowing white light weaved its way across the night sky. It was solid. That much was clear. As it passed, it blocked out the stars behind it, proving it wasn't some distant illusion or reflection. They started running through every possible explanation. Not an airplane. There were no blinking navigation lights, no steady flight path. Not a satellite. Those moved in straight lines, predictable and unchanging. Not a meteor. This thing wasn't falling. It was moving with purpose. A helicopter, maybe. But no, if a chopper were flying that high, they would definitely hear it. Sound carried differently in the wilderness, especially in a canyon this size. The rotor noise would have echoed off the canyon walls, bouncing back at them in deep, rolling waves. But there was nothing. Dead silence. Nick felt the hair on his arms stand up. There was something unnatural about this. Not just the movement, not just the eerie quiet. It was the feeling. Like they were watching something. And it was watching them. As the object drifted directly overhead, a cold realization settled deep in Nick's gut. This thing, whatever it was aware of them. It wasn't just some distant anomaly. It wasn't mindlessly moving through the sky. It knew it was being watched. And in that moment, Nick swore he could feel it watching back. A shudder ran through his entire body, an instinctual, primal reaction, something deep in his mind, screaming that this was wrong. That whatever was above them was not natural. Beside him, David was silent, just as frozen as he was. They sat there, locked in place, watching as the object continued its strange, fluid path across the sky. Then, just as smoothly as it had appeared, it vanished, slipping behind the opposite canyon wall, swallowed by the night. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled, the wind rustled the trees. Then finally, they turned to each other. David's voice was barely above a whisper. Asterisk, what in the hell was that? Nick exhaled, his hands clammy, his mind still racing. Asterisk, what did we just see? To this day, Nick still doesn't know what they saw. He's not saying it was an alien spacecraft. But if the definition of a UFO is an unidentified flying object, well, this definitely fit the bill. It was solid. It blocked out the stars. It didn't move like anything conventional or anything natural. And then there was the buck. Nick still couldn't shake the feeling that the two events, the unnatural, aggression of the deer, and the impossible object in the sky, were connected. David, though, he refuses to talk about it. He's buried that night somewhere deep, locked it away like it never happened. But for Nick, the memory still lingers, creeping back whenever he stares up at the night sky. The whole night had felt wrong. Like they were out of place, like reality itself had shifted, if only for a few hours. And when he looks at the bigger picture, at all the theories in physics, the possibilities of other dimensions, parallel universes, even the idea that we live in some kind of simulation, he can't help but wonder. Maybe that night in the canyon, they didn't just witness something strange. Maybe for a brief moment, they slipped through a glitch in the matrix. Something happened that night. Something strange. Something unexplainable. Nick knows that. And honestly, he doesn't care if anyone believes him. If you were hearing this from someone else, he probably wouldn't believe it either. Hell, sometimes even he questions it. But no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many times he's tried to rationalize it, he knows what he saw, what he felt. Up until now, he's only ever shared this story with close friends, people he trusts. And even then, there's always that hesitation, that doubt in their eyes. But this is the first time he's ever publicly acknowledged it. Because at the end of the day, reality is personal. Each of us only knows what our senses and our consciousness allow us to perceive. Nick isn't here to convince anyone. He's not trying to prove anything. It didn't happen to you. It happened to him. And that's all there is to it. Arjun had spent most of his life in the city, but his family made sure he never forgot his roots. Their village, deep in Rajasthan, was nothing like the crowded streets and busy markets he was used to. It was vast and open stretch of desert with barely any vegetation, just endless land and an unforgiving sun. They visited often, and over time, Arjun made plenty of friends there. Every evening, before the desert swallowed the land in darkness, they would run out and play, making the most of the cool air. The days were too hot, and the nights were something else entirely. It wasn't just the usual dangers, wild animals, and evil men who lurked where they shouldn't. There were other things in the dark, things that weren't supposed to exist. And one evening, Arjun came face to face with one. That night had started like any other. He, his cousin, and their friends were playing in the open fields, shouting, laughing, their voices echoing across the empty land. They had no idea something was listening. That night, after the games and laughter had faded, everyone went to bed. The village was silent, wrapped in the heavy darkness of the desert night. Then, Arjun woke up. A clicking sound echoed in the distance, rhythmic, strange. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, just enough to crawl under his skin. At first, it was just annoying. Then, it became fascinating. Curious, he nudged his cousin Jagdish, who was sleeping beside him. Groggy and half awake, Jagdish mumbled in irritation. But when Arjun asked him what the sound was, he had no answer. Arjun had an idea. Let's go see what it is. Jagdish, being older and a village boy, shut that down immediately. Going out at night, following something strange, that was the kind of thing that got people lost or worse. Instead, they settled for creeping toward the main gate, sitting just inside, listening. The clicking sound wasn't mechanical. It wasn't an insect or an animal. It was someone. Someone making that sound with their tongue. The sound began to fade, drifting farther away into the night. The boys leaned in, straining to hear, and then a scream, followed by a voice. It was his own voice, calling out from the side of the house, mimicking the way he called Jagdish while playing. Arjun froze, because he was right here. Who or what was calling his cousin's name? They ran, without hesitation. Arjun and Jagdish bolted straight to where the elders were sleeping. In the village, everyone slept outside in the open, under the vast desert sky. The adults were already awake. The scream had woken them. His uncles gathered everyone together, making them sit close. Then, without hesitation, they began to pray. Only once the prayers had started did one of them finally speak. It was a Shalava, they said. A creature known to the villagers, feared by them. Many had encountered it, but no one had ever truly seen it. Its real form was unknown. Because the Shalava didn't just show itself, it copied. Sometimes it stole your voice, calling out to lure you away, just like it had done with Arjun's. Other times, it stole your body, mimicking your form, but never perfectly. People who had glimpsed their own double described it as something off, as if the creature was wearing a body like an ill-fitting suit, something that shouldn't exist, standing right in front of them, so they prayed. And as they sat there, huddled in the darkness, the thing outside screamed Jagdish's name again and again using Arjun's voice. But none of them moved, none of them answered, and eventually, the Shalava faded into the night. Whatever it had wanted, it didn't get it. But Arjun knew, deep down, that it was still out there. Listening, waiting. Some stories stay with you forever. Not because you want them to, but because they demand to be remembered. Arjun never forgot that night, the voice that wasn't his, the way the darkness felt alive, the way his family huddled together, praying instead of fighting. Some things aren't meant to be seen. Some things aren't meant to be understood. And some things, like the Shalava, are better left alone. To this day, he doesn't talk about it much. But every time he visits the village, every time the sun dips below the horizon and the desert night settles in, he remembers. And he listens. Because once you know something is out there, watching, waiting, mimicking, you never really feel alone again. If you made it this far, you know this story isn't just another campfire tale. Maybe you've heard whispers of something similar. Maybe you've felt it. Have you ever heard something call your name something that shouldn't have? Tell your story in the comments. And if you want more terrifying encounters like this, make sure to subscribe, because in the world of horror, the scariest stories are always the true ones. Sleep well. If you can.